And thank you, everyone. My name is Vanessa Mason. I'm a research director at Institute for the Future. And I'm excited to be here this morning with Brad Kreit to talk about technology forecasting, which I'm sure is both a super interesting and also a contentious topic for us to explore today. If you're not already familiar with Institute for the Future, we are one of the, if not the oldest, futures research organization in the world. We help individuals, organizations think systematically about the future. And so what we are here today to focus on is our Ask a Futurist series, which really just allows all of you to be able to ask questions of all of our researchers here at Institute for the Future, explore different topics of interest, maybe that we're looking at internally or that are just really of interest, and folks that are also thinking about the future themselves. So this is a series that is supported by our IFTF Vantage program, which is our organizational partnership program. If you are not familiar with it, you will have an opportunity to learn more about it. Towards the end of this, I'll share a little bit more information about that. But here are all of the advantages to being part of IFTF Vantage. Largely our annual map of the decade, which nicely I'm sure will be a topic of conversation today. Our last year's map was focused on technology forecasting, so it'll be really timely to bring that in to this conversation. And with that, just wanted to stop sharing slides and turn things over to Brad for our first question, which is, of course, the big question. You know, Brad, when you do technology forecasting, what are some of the ways that you see or some of the needs that are required for technology forecasting as opposed to maybe some other forecasts that you work on? And you might be muted.
Crazy mute button. Sure. So should I start just by giving a little bit of background on some of the projects I've done and kind of how we've looked at technology over the years at IFTF?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a great way to show.
Okay, sure. So I've been a researcher with Institute for the Future for closing in on 13 years or something like that at this point, kind of getting hard to count length of time. And over the years, I've worked, I started actually my career at IFTF as a health researcher. And about 5-6 years ago, I was asked to move into our technology forecasting team and lead the research for our technology forecasting team, and now lead the research for our Vantage partnership. But in that context, I've had a lot of different opportunities that I think kind of give me some helpful perspective on thinking about technology in different industries and different contexts. So, it's just one, I'm not by nature, or I'm not by training a technologist. I've always had an interest in technology and grew up as a very little kid learning computers from 5-6 years old. But I'm not a technologist by training. And so part of what I've been able to do is sort of learn how to work with technologists, understand where they're coming from, and then use that to sort of help inform strategy, help inform how users might think about things, and help inform just different industries. And it's all a little bit different. So with that context, I mean, I guess, I can start by just kind of giving a little bit of a high level sort of approach to how we do technology forecasting, if that's helpful. And last year, I believe, Vanessa and I were talking prior to this, prepping for this meeting, and we were both realizing that neither of us really remembers what we did last year. So it was last year I wrote this, but you may be experiencing the same thing. And we could put that link maybe in the chat. A piece for our Foresight Essentials training program, where I tried to outline really kind of methodologically how we go about doing science and technology forecasting. And this isn't the only way, and I can talk about variations, of course. But I think this is sort of, in that I outlined what, we really think of as kind of the 4 core questions that we'll often be asking when we're doing a science and technology project. And so the first one, and I think this is sort of one way that science and technology forecasting is a little bit different from some other kinds of foresight fields, is the first question that we're asking is, what technical advances do really deep experts expect in the next decade? And we can ask that question in a bunch of different ways. We can say, what are your assumptions? Where do you think this is headed? Kind of draw out the roadmap, that kind of thing. And I think what's a little bit different about this is that if you talk to let's say an expert in wireless communication who really understands things like, the sort of the wave spectrums involved in 5G and are in the conversations about whatever the spectrum around 6G will be and the towers and all that kind of stuff. They actually have a pretty good, it's not 100% clear, but they have a pretty good understanding of where things are headed in a way that is a little bit different, I think, from social forecasting. So, when you're trying to understand social trends, it's, there's a lot of variation. There's a lot of, things can swing radically one way or another. I just saw something this morning that was joking around about how 4 years ago, there was a lot of speculation about how Mark Zuckerberg was going to run for president in 2020. And obviously the public relations around him has changed radically. So social forecasting, there's a lot of space for change. There's a lot of uncertainty. But at the most basic level, technical experts have a pretty good understanding of where they think things are headed. And it's not perfect, and things change and all of that. But you can get a pretty good outline. So just as a starting point, we really try to do that kind of homework. And from there, I think that really serves a couple of purposes. One, and over the years at IFTF that I've worked at IFTF, when we've presented technology research, we work with a lot of big tech companies. So we work with Google, we work with Facebook, we work with Intel, we work with Qualcomm, technical people. I remember doing a workshop a couple of years ago where, prior to the workshop starting, the conversation between the team we were working with was about physics journals that they read in their spare time. And so these are people who, like, they're gonna interrogate the technology. We have to get it right. So for one thing, it serves a purpose of just making sure that we've done our homework. For another thing, if you present that to a group that's really technical, they're gonna have their own perspectives, but you better be credible, or else it's just, what are you doing? And then the third, I think, is then, you really are not just doing your homework and showing that you know your stuff, but it gives you a real credible perspective about what's changing. So it gives you a depiction of 5-10 years out that's pretty reasonable and that everybody can start to work with. So that's kind of just the starting point. And we use a lot of expert interviews. On technology teams I've been involved with, we have our own internal technologists who, for instance, one of our colleagues, Mike Leopold, who's done a lot of our tech work over the years, was a ex Intel, ex Apple, ex Netscape, kind of worked at all the big tech firms over his career. And so we work with people like that to really just understand the technical underpinnings. And feel free to pause me at any point, Vanessa.
Yeah, I actually, like, there's a good question that someone had, and I think you alluded to this a little bit, but just that they were asking, how do you avoid basically more linear forecasts, given that the technologists, maybe have a clear idea of where things are going? I think in a lot of ways they're rather optimistic about the nature of change, and it might be more exponential. And so how do you both kind of balance the technical capabilities with the maybe messiness of the sort of social and other contexts that are less roadmap like?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so I can for sure talk about that a little bit. And there are lots of different ways we try to do that. So one is when we think about constructing a research team around kind of a technology project, we are, so it kind of broadly speaking, our technology research, we have probably 3 categories of internal research experts, and they really blend. So nobody fits into one of these categories, and just, it's just, that's all they do. But in general, when we put together a research team on a technology project, we need the technologists. We need to know the technology. We need to have that understood in a thoughtful manner. The second category is that, you might think of as kind of broad experts in, like, business, for lack of a better word. People who are going to assess and understand what is the business landscape. Is this a real market, or is this just something fun and interesting? Who will kind of approach a question about technology from a sort of a mindset, first and foremost, of a business strategist. And then the third kind of expert I would say that we have, and these are all folks who kind of also have foresight training, but the third kind of expertise we bring is either, you could think of it as a user research lens or a social scientist lens. Somebody who's really going to start from the perspective of, okay, this is all nice and shiny, but what will it do for people? Why will they care? Won't people be skeptical? That kind of thing. And so one of the things I think when it's often, but not always, the social scientists who are the skeptics. It's also often the business folks who are skeptics. It's usually the technologists are very excited about the technology. And again, that's not always the case. But often what we'll have are people who, as part of the conversation of first what we're trying to do is understand the technical underpinnings. The next question is kind of how do we bring them together? How do they come together in interesting ways? But then we also kind of have to challenge ourselves and really say, okay, that's great, but so what? What does it enable? What's the value? Why will people want this? Will there be skeptics? And really ask all those kinds of questions. I think, and I would say that that's increasingly important. When I started my career at IFTF, it was in 2009. So there was an iPhone. There were iPhones. They were a thing that they were a thing that existed and that people had, but they also weren't. It was still much more common to see a flip phone than a smartphone, and you would still encounter people who are really skeptical of mobile devices and that kind of thing. But I think the kind of innovation that we had 10, 12, 15, 20 years ago, there were lots of efficiencies around kind of digitization in various forms that were just really hard to argue with. Now, I think when you look at, for me anyway, I'm pretty skeptical of NFTs. I'm pretty skeptical of virtual reality. Just that, not that there isn't value there, but that I don't necessarily imagine that. I have a lot of skepticism that we're going to want to spend lots and lots of time with virtual reality headsets on as a large number of people. So I think more and more as we advance, it's harder to make an obvious case. And so you have to be a little bit more skeptical when you're thinking about tech forecasting.
Yeah, I kind of think of like the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like the iPhone solves like a lot of like critical basic needs. And so it's really easy to see from an adoption perspective, if you're able to find work, run a business, connect socially, like find housing, find a job, like all those sort of things. But a VR headset, at least at this point, is very entertainment and curiosity focused and less.
Right. Well, and I don't think, like I'm not totally skeptical of some work or professional uses of VR, let's just say as an example. So, my wife and I have thought about expanding our house. We have 2 kids and are in a 2-bedroom house. So we either are going to need to expand or move, and that's kind of on our radar. And it would be really cool to have some kind of VR depiction of architectural plans. That would be much nicer, much more valuable than me trying to read architectural sketches, which I, can't really do in a meaningful way. So that would be, there's tons of fields like that where I think, engineering and architecture, where like, sure, there's probably some opportunities there to do something interesting that will really meaningfully add value. But if you're just talking about, like, hey, let's, let's talk through this report or whatever, like, no, I don't think I would want to do this meeting in VR necessarily, at least not where the technology is now. And it's hard for me to imagine wanting to do this in VR. Personally, it doesn't mean I won't end up doing it, but right now I'm skeptical of it.
Sure. And yeah, and I think that said, we did get a question that kind of broadly, I'm trying to think of the best way to summarize this, but I think it somewhat relates to this question of placing humans in the center of this discussion around like new like market opportunities. So how can we not just like in thinking about a skepticism point of view, but as we think about forecasts and the interaction between, the market, user needs and technology, how do we make sure that we are keeping people in the center of that forecast?
Sure. And if you, let me, let's see, can I actually share my screen here? I wanted to pull up in a slide here. That's okay. Can you see like a series of maps?
Yes, I do.
Okay, so this is one example I use a lot, and it's like a super old, it's kind of an interesting project because it was like a super old research project. I think probably 10, 12 years old now. It was from Yahoo Labs back when, Yahoo Labs was a place to be, and they used Flickr data back when Flickr was like a place to post photos. that people use. So it's a really old project, but I still think it's one of the most interesting and creative technology projects that I've come across in years. So I show this a lot because I think it really drives home a point about putting people at the center of forecasting. So what's pictured here, if you haven't figured it out, is the folks at the team that did this wanted to think through, could you reimagine maps so that you weren't just optimizing for efficiency? You weren't just optimizing from the fastest way between point A and point B, but you could optimize for other kinds of things. So, some of the creations here is a map organized around beauty, a quiet map, and a happy map. And these are just different paths you could take from point A to point B in London. And what I love about this is, like, I think for most of us, most of the time we would choose route A. Most of us are, commuting is not very fun, whatever. Like, we don't, who wants to spend more time in their car, kind of thing. But I personally, I've spent almost no time in London. My entire experience in London was a weird sort of flight I had that allowed me to spend one afternoon, one evening in London before heading back to the US. So if I were to find myself in London again, I don't really think the shortest route would necessarily be the best route for me. I might want the most beautiful route, or one of the examples I like to think about is, maybe you want to have a more personal conversation with somebody, or it's an important work meeting, or you're on a date, or whatever it is. You would want a quiet route. And so I think one of the things that technology innovation has been really good at is option A. And technology innovation, at least as we've experienced it for the last 20 years, has not been as good at B, C, D, and whatever other options you could imagine after D. And so one of the things I think that in our technology research we've increasingly challenged people to do is just think about what values is the technology optimizing for that you're creating. Is it just optimizing for pure efficiency or pure engagement or pure productivity? And it's not that those are, we're never going to, that's never going to go away as a value that people care about. People are always going to want more efficient ways to do things. People are always going to try to be more productive. But, in much the same way that that's not the only thing you try to do with your personal life, I think a real sweet spot for technology innovation is thinking about these other kinds of opportunities. And so that's kind of one space I think there's a lot of opportunity to sort of think about how do you put people in the center of what they care about.
Yeah, thank you. I love that. That's always like a super visual example. And I think that one that everyone can relate to, that sometimes you're always the shortest point is not always the best point.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Looking at other questions that folks have submitted. We have a question on about basically if you're a company and you've already identified maybe a specific technology that you're looking at, how do you go about, maybe in light of this conversation, like how do you go about identifying customer needs? Like when you think about forecasts, how do you sort of maybe prioritize whose needs or think about whose needs maybe aren't being addressed by a particular kind of technology?
Sure. So one thing that I probably didn't say as clearly as I could have, so maybe to kind of circle back to kind of how we start to approach technology, is one of the things that over the years we've really developed an approach around is thinking about you call it combinatorial innovation or combinations of technology. We usually use the phrase combinatorial innovation. And the basic upshot is, in much the same way that in today's world, whatever your phone is, whatever, if you have a voice assistant speaker, whatever it is, those are all combinations of things. The Amazon Echo that I have is, it's a combination of advances in microphones and cloud computing and so on. So it's not one technology, it's one product, but it's a bunch of different foundations or a bunch of different elements. And so one thing I should say is that when we sort of put together a technology forecast, we're really trying to understand how do you combine the elements into something interesting. And then this question here about how can a company, after identifying a relevant technology for their market, identify upcoming customer needs. I mean, I think it's an interesting question, and Vanessa, I'd be curious also kind of what you think about, because so both of us have backgrounds in health and health research. I mentioned I started my career at IFTF in health, and that's always a really interesting space to look at technology because it's sort of there have been sort of radical acceleration of digitization of health due to COVID. And still, if you look at the kinds of things that could be done, there's a very big gap between what is done and what could be done. But there are lots of good reasons for that. So I always like these examples um, of mental health and AI. There's like, going back to the earliest uses of chatbots, it's kind of a famous story in the history of technology. There's this bot called Eliza bot that was a kind of, I think the term is Rogerian therapist, that would just spit back questions at you. So I'm really upset. Well, what are you upset about? I'm upset because my kids are fighting. Why are they fighting? It would just kind of ask you it would pick up a keyword and ask a question. And people got addicted to this bot back in the 1960s. And so, fast forward whatever we are, 50, 60 years ahead, there's some really kind of interesting sort of projects from academic labs around therapy bots, but nobody's picked up on them. And you could say, well, there's obviously a user need, there's obviously a technological solution, so what's the gap? And I don't know, I'm curious, I'd be curious to know, Vanessa, if you have thoughts. I mean, I have thoughts. I'm curious to know what you think.
Yeah, part of the thing I think that makes both health technology or digital health so complex and also so interesting is that, customer needs is not as straightforward in health as it is maybe in other industries. There's the customer that is like the end user. So that is the patient. There's the customer that might be the physician or the sort of health provider that's using the thing. And then there's some sort of financial intermediary in some kind of way, or some kind of regulatory intermediary that also is a bureaucratic system that's generally faceless. And so I think the question of whose needs are being served is always at the sort of the forefront in health technology, and whose needs get prioritized first. That then becomes the next question. And so to your point about chatbots and why they haven't happened, I think some of it is talking about messy social context. People haven't been, one, as comfortable with the concept of therapy, and two, not as comfortable certainly with not having therapy be in person. But I think that now there's more customer willingness and openness there. But I think that the professionals who are the therapists are very uncomfortable with the concept of their job being somewhat automated or at least replicable in that sense, or standardized. And so that kind of resistance is really hard to overcome.
It's interesting. It's interesting you bring that up on the provider side, because that's on the one, health is a very messy market, and very, very sort of country dependent. And on the provider side in the US, providers don't want to lose money at some level.
That too, and, less.
And then I think the other thing for me I always think about is like, sure, it's possible to use a chatbot, but like if I were like really experiencing some emotionally fraught situation, do I want to I don't know, do I want to go to like chatbottherapist.com and just start like some people would, like, I mean, not to say, and there are projects, but it's there are user gaps and there's trust issues and all these kinds of things. So it's an interesting case. So I think one thing that I've observed over the years on the technology side is over and over, you see big tech companies looking, health, education, some of these markets that are harder to crack for a variety of different reasons, but are also really big. And they come at it and just say, well, we're Google, we have lots of technology and lots of money and some of the world's most talented people. So we're just going to like throw that stuff at this market and some money will, shake some money out. And, over and over again, they don't, they run into barriers. And I think there's an underestimation of, in some of these cases, of just how hard the markets are to crack, or how emotional and personal user needs are. And so you see these kinds of things. So that's kind of one kind of just observation there. Another way that we often think about user needs is through a very different kind of research study. And I think, Vanessa, you've probably done as many, if not more of these than I have. So again, I might put you on the spot here. So we ask two futurists. But we do this kind of work called leading edge behavior research. And when I joined IFTF, we were hosting meetup groups for this group of people called the Quantified Self Meetup, or Quantified Self Movement. And this was back again in 12 years ago, 2009. And these folks were like doing really weird things where they would track their weight in spreadsheets and stuff that just like from the outside just seemed like, why on earth are you doing this with your time? but we had enough of an understanding of where, of the potential for wearables and where mobile devices were headed and that kind of thing to say, well, this is like really, cumbersome now, but it will be technically not cumbersome in the future. And there's an underlying need here. The underlying need in that case was people just wanted to understand themselves better. They wanted to understand their health better. They wanted to understand their bodies better, whatever it might be. And so one way that we kind of approach this question is just where are the people at the edges who are doing something interesting or doing something unique or different. So, and we look, in much the same way that in foresight research, we look at weak signals. So signals of change, things that are kind of on the fringes that point toward a potential larger direction of change or larger disruption. We look for the people who are doing that, and we try to figure out, okay, this is a lot of work. So why are you doing this, and what does it represent? What's the demand it represents? And again, I don't know, Vanessa, if you have other thoughts on that, because I think that's another way that I think about kind of a consumer-led approach to technology research.
Yeah, and I think it's one that doesn't get used as much in companies because, of course, at the end, if there's a technology that they're interested in, they're very focused on market size and total addressable market and immediately thinking about scale. And so I think that's one way to both avoid maybe some other linear views of what the technology could be or what combinations of the technology could be, as well as discovering novel areas, novel customer needs or sort of novel customer segments, is certainly looking to the edges of things. Because sometimes starting out with scale is not always the best approach for things. We have a question from Ellen about hindsight, which I think is always an interesting one for futures. This is specific to the conversation we were having around like the iPhone, but she was saying, do you think it's easy to see the use case for the iPhone now with so much hindsight and near ubiquity of adoption of smartphones? Could the same happen for VR headsets 10 to 15 years from now? So I think maybe just addressing and thinking about technology forecasting, I feel like we get this question a lot, basically, how do you know that you're right? How do you know, right. How can you, not predict, but yeah.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So in 2008, 2009, 2010, if you go back to, and I was not part of our technology team then, but if you go back to what our technology team was doing at the time, we put out these visualizations we call artifacts from the future, which are kind of, I'm training as an anthropologist, so I like to think of it as an archaeologist instead of going back in time, going forward in time and sort of bringing a snapshot of what a future might look like to us. And so these artifacts from the future from 2008, 2009, 2010, it almost got to the point where where I remember one of our colleagues had to basically say no more phones in the artifacts. Phones are obviously going to be a big deal, but we need another form factor than a phone. And so we actually were pretty good with that. We did kind of see that. But there are probably two comments there. One is that almost for us isn't the point. Not that we do our best. We really do try to assess where we think things are headed, and we have a pretty good track record and all that. But ultimately, the goal isn't to get the people who are working us together in a room, those people from 2010 to say, hey, come back, meet us now, and weren't we smart? That, why bother? So we're not trying to do that. We're trying to use a depiction of the future to understand what's possible in the present, and kind of inform strategy in the present. So at some level, rightness isn't the question. But there's sort of a separate question there in terms of how we use history in technology forecasting. And I think one good example, and if I can pull up in another, let's see if I have it. Let me get the slide first, and then I'll get the, so this will take me a second. But a couple of years ago, we did a project on the future of communications. And let's see, this should be, okay, are you seeing like a 3 time horizon?
Yeah, but I just see it from your notes perspective instead of the slides. Swap displays.
Let's see. Okay, swap displays. Sorry about that. Okay, so here we should go. Okay. So this was actually now work we did a few years ago on the future of communications. And part of that work, we did kind of the get a bunch of technologists into a room and have them tell us what they think and have them brainstorm about technical possibilities and that kind of stuff. And then we worked with a group of artists and a group of business folks So we did some of the parts that I've already described, but part of what we did is more of a desk research effort was to try to understand the historical evolution of communications technology to contextualize how communications technology might continue to evolve. So, the first, this model here, this cascading S curves, it's sort of a classic diffusion of innovation. Uh, I can't remember the exact name of it, but it's a sort of classic way of visualizing technical innovation. So the first wave, you could probably describe this through different methods, but the way we described it was the first wave of communications technology of the 20th century was mass communications, TV, radio, phone. And phone was a little bit of an outlier because I'd call you, you'd call me, but that was it. There was no way to sort of broaden the conversation. And that was basically the world we existed in from, let's say, 1930, 1940, depending on if you want to do radio or TV and so on. But that was the world of the second half of the 20th century, let's say. Social media came, really started maturing meaningfully, let's say 2005, give or take. And that was kind of the next wave of innovation. And so when we looked at that, I say, okay, so what's changing? And part of our understanding of the communications technology, again, this was a few years ago, was you could look across what different big names in technology, but also technical folks were saying. So at the time, this was when Facebook was really starting to bet heavily on VR and AR, and now they're becoming a metaverse company, or whatever it is they're doing. But 5 years ago, it was just that was the breaking news. Was they were saying, okay, we're going to be in VR and AR. Google, this was the time when their founder stepped down from being CEO, and Sundar Pichai took over, and his first shareholder letter was Google is going to be an AI first company. And you could kind of go down this list of lots of different things. Voice speakers were emerging, wearables were getting interesting, lots and lots of things were emerging all at once. And so our argument from the way we assess the technology at the time, and I think this is held up pretty well if you look at how innovation is evolving, is that at the time in 2016, 2017, everyone was asking, what's the next big thing? And that was actually a misleading question because we'd focused on past historical innovations. There was one big thing, there was mass media, or there was social media. And what we argued is instead we should prepare for ambient communications, which is really a diffusion of lots of different kinds of possibilities. And so one way that we were using history, just to kind of circle back to the original question here, is we were both using it to understand how things have changed over time, but to remind ourselves that change doesn't necessarily happen the same way over and over again. And so in this context, I think because we had an assumption that there's one next big thing, and every 10, 15, 20 years, there's a new wave of digital and computational communications innovation, we should just expect that. And VR will win out, or AR will win out, or voice phone assistants will win out. And instead, I think what you're seeing now is, VR is much better. And, for all that I'm a skeptic of it, it's like for sure, way more enjoyable than it was 5 years ago. AR is still, not really practical, but it's a lot closer than it was. And, voice assistants are a lot, like so much better in terms of being able to pick up on contextual information, or, you can ask a question like, what time are the Warriors playing? And, it knows like that's a basketball question, and it knows lots of, the voice assistants are much, much better at context. So all this stuff is, I think, getting better in a way that sort of hints at it, a reminder that when we look at history, it can both inform what we're doing, but also remind us to challenge our own assumptions about how things are changing. Let me stop sharing here now.
Yeah, I think that's a really great reminder that, technology forecasting isn't always about turning toward the future, but really trying to place things in context. All right. And I think we have, well, kind of related to this, what are some of the biggest mistakes made in with technology forecasting? I don't know if you have an example of this, maybe, yeah, thinking of a project or something.
Yeah, and that's a good question. I do think one of them is, one of the big ones is optimism. Like one of the big ones is optimism, and you see that a lot where people, again, by almost by definition, or sort of self-selection, people who are, if you're a PhD roboticist, you love robots. If you're a PhD, if you're developing the next AR headset, it's like you're not doing it because you think AR is like crappy, that you really like believe in AR. And so at some level, I think there is a lot of kind of optimism around like, this will solve all our problem. This will be really great and everybody will want it. Or there's a lot of kind of neat and tidy, then the computer will know. And then once the computer knows, we're all taken care of. And so there's you see like on the one hand, lots of, I think, super optimistic kind of solutions. And then I think you also do see, and this is in part when I was talking about how we construct research teams for technology, we really do try to balance, and I don't have like a spreadsheet or anything, but we do try to think about different perspectives or different lenses that people will bring, and sometimes assign different lenses, because if one common category of error is optimism, I think another common category of error is just pessimism. It's like, my market's too hard, people won't want this, this is too difficult, no, or this is just what those like weird tech people will do. I mean, and I think you hear this less. I mean, again, I think there's been a radical shift in the 10, 12 years I've been doing this. But when I started my career, I remember I did a lot of talks and workshops and things at with hospitals, systems, healthcare providers, health insurers, basically that whole industry. And you would and I would confront a lot of people who are just like, oh, like what are those like freaks who are always on their phones doing? And, like stuff like that, where it's just like people clearly felt like there was no value in consumer technology, because what they were doing was the hard work of like, of medical care, which is hard work and frankly a lot more important than like me getting Twitter on my phone. But it's a mistake to assume that it's a mistake to just be super pessimistic, and there's probably a couple of reasons for that. One is just the technology will continue to get better. So, for all that I'm not big on virtual reality right now, I am aware that 5-10 years from now, it will be much more compelling. It doesn't mean I want to live my life in it, but it will be much more compelling. And it's also a misunderstanding of how users will adopt things. I think, again, when I was confronting a lot of skepticism around phones in healthcare, it was at a time where it was 20% of the population, let's say, that had smartphones, and people would say, well, I'm trying to treat Medicaid patients who can't afford barely afford food. Why they're not going to have this fancy device? And it's like, well, now that's probably maybe the only way to reach them in terms of digital communications relative to anything else you might try. So I think there's a misunderstanding of user adoption, of cost curves, and that kind of thing, that that we get pessimistic because something doesn't work now. But that's we're not trying to figure out what works now. We're trying to figure out what's going to work 5-10 years from now. And so when you look at it from that perspective, it's like, yeah, this stuff will get better, and people will want it in some way or another, or people may want it in some way or another.
Yeah, it's like when I think about technology forecasting, like the first thing that comes to mind is so much of like those official futures. I feel like this is an industry that thrives on official futures. Either AI is going to take all the jobs, or the
Right.
PR is going to be where we all live. Like very like kind of headline broadcast kinds of notions of things.
Yeah, I mean, and I think like there's also like I think a kind of hidden business dynamic to all of that now, where like the growth expectations of the big tech companies are so high for them to justify their market cap and all this kind of stuff. Like if they aren't successful, like there's no reason they should be valued what they're valued at. And so they kind of need to put forth a big vision as to why the thing that they're building is the thing. And so some of it's that. But there are also, I think, just a ton of just like official, like, oh, this AI will solve all our problems. And it just, I think you do need to be both skeptical that it will solve all of our problems, and also aware that, it'll probably help us with some of them.
Yeah. We did have someone ask a specific question about AI and basically how we use AI and machine learning in our forecasting techniques. I don't know if that does.
That's a good question. So, I mean, it's a tricky question because I think we pull in, we certainly pull in, different people look at, use different approaches. And I think some people use, Google alerts and things like that, which you could arguably call a form of AI. We've had researchers who really utilize QUID and other patent analysis tools to map out, on the theory that if something, if you have a high number of patents in a particular area now, it suggests that 5, 7, 10 years down the road, some chunk of those are going to be commercialized. So if you see an uptick in the patent, so we've had different researchers use different approaches. I think I would say when we think, or at least when I think about, foresight and kind of on a longer time horizon, what we are trying to do, that the best uses of AI I've seen are in the aggregation of evidence and sort of pulling together information. And I think the best uses I've seen are kind of in an understanding that, the machine learning tools, at least in their current form, are good at finding things, but and interpretation of sort of short-term phenomena, like for sure, but longer term change, you really have to ask a set of questions that at least nothing I've come across is good at asking yet. It doesn't mean it won't be. So I think where we kind of see the relationship is, is using machine learning tools to inform how we're thinking and what we're expecting, and then using that to ask more informed questions. And again, ultimately, I think if the goal of this kind of work is to use a plausible, internally consistent, provocative, and well-informed perspective on the future to inform the present, and inform how strategic decision makers make decisions in the present, a lot of what we have to do is ultimately ask kind of more questions about how do we really engage people. And that's, again, I think AI is not good at that, at least not yet.
Yeah, and thanks for linking to that as well, because I think, there's a tendency to really, even if we aren't focusing on getting a technology forecast right, that necessarily that because it's provocative that people will believe it. And I think sometimes we sort of lose like that sort of communication and either convincing people and ultimately focusing on like, well, what are they doing about the forecast, or what are they reacting to, and less about, is the forecast correct? At least that's what we're really focused on at IFTF, is not really like predicting the future, but really getting people to act. And whether it's out of optimism or out of pessimism, ultimately
Right.
getting people to make a change based on things. A language about what the purpose is. Yes, so in case you're not familiar with, this is a basic sort of principle or framework for all Institute for the Future research, is based on our foresight, insight, action cycle. So the technology forecasting, so the stories of the future are the foresight that are meant to provoke insights that ultimately lead to action in the present. So that's our sort of underlying really brief explanation of that. And so hopefully that's something that you can take as you look at your technology forecasting work too, that, don't just focus on crafting the story of the future and crafting something that is, necessarily right or correct. But really you want to get people to be able to take action, or sort of move them to a point where they're taking action. That's really the measure of success that we're looking at. Great. Well, we've got another specific question about work. Yes. Oh, yes. Thank you for adding that, Maureen. Actually, I can show that to folks now. Speaking of things, I'm going to contextualize this, but also, so this is something that we've shown a lot at IFTF. This is a forecast from 1971, written by Bob, I believe, right, Brad? Bob Johansson.
Yeah, Bob, some of our colleagues, I think he was involved, but I'm not
Yes.
really
sure. I think he said that, and Paul Barron, who's also one of the co-founders of IFTF. But you can see here some things that might seem very familiar to you, written about in 1971. So this is really a forecast written in 1971, basically the sort of very beginnings of the internet, and looking at what could be possible in terms of what then were called home information services, based on using the internet. So things like cashless society transactions, which of course are all our digital payments that all of us familiar today, all kind of Venmo, PayPal, Apple Pay, to a dedicated newspaper. So all the media that we all consume and probably overconsume created by the internet, computer aided school instruction, which of course now we are even more familiar with than we maybe were before 2 years ago. Shopping transactions, things like person-to-person paid work at home. So Marina's dropped the link to this in the chat. But again, while this is obviously, that feeling of like, wow, that was very accurate for 1971. And thinking about the internet when virtually no one had internet inside their homes. This was still something that really lived with the military, with academic institutions. And so being able to imagine what becomes possible if this were to scale. Obviously, there's a quote that's on our office window that if you've never seen in a presentation, I'm sure you will at some point, but it says, any useful statement about the future is it feel ridiculous or be ridiculous? It's any useful statement about the future should be ridiculous. And certainly in 1971, all of these things like computer tutors and dedicated newspaper and shopping transactions certainly were ridiculous. But that's part of the marker of having a good forecast, is that obviously various people then kind of took these things or were provoked to take action to make these things reality. And so again, focusing less on the sort of accuracy of this and more of thinking about what becomes actionable, what needs to also wrap around these things too. Like while these are obviously all companies, there's various regulatory structures, there's all kinds of technical infrastructure, there are policies, there are ways of supporting sort of behaviors around these kinds of things that are all necessary to be crafted in order for these things to scale and mainstream. And so I don't want folks to lose that, in light of the technology forecast piece of this, like there are all the implications and consequences that flow from that as well. And so you want people to be engaged in that thought process and in that dialogue when you're crafting your forecasts.
So it looks like we have a couple more questions. I don't know if we want to get to these. So there's a question. If the company identifies a technology that's relevant to an industry but doesn't know how to implement it, what could the team, what could the team do to define a use case? It's a fun question. I don't know if you want to answer. I can answer it, or I can start, and you can feel free to chime in as well. I think for me, I mean, this would be again where you would want to do some, either lead edge behavior research or consumer insight kind of research, or kind of more traditional market research of one sort or another. So that's kind of like one way you might try to understand it. I think the other thing, and this is probably just another category of error that I think I've seen over the years doing foresight, of when you're doing long-term thinking, you're really trying to imagine very big picture changes. You're not trying to imagine, this bag of chips will, be 10 cents more. Like that's not an interesting long-term forecast. So you're trying to think through what are the really big changes, but then you also have to remind yourself that it's actually, you're thinking on a long time horizon. And so strategically, you've given yourself space to act small or act slowly. It doesn't mean you shouldn't act at all. You shouldn't just say, well, I can't act at all. But so I think one of the things, if you say, okay, like, to take again an example like chatbots in healthcare, and you say, well, what should we do? Well, what you should not do is, invest billions of dollars and like massive, do a massive rollout without really like validating use cases and figure out what people need. But, figure out what's one target population you could try this with, who might, what's the small experiment where a book I'm reading now called The Long Game. I think the author's name is Dory Clark, and she describes it as how do you win even if you're losing? And so like, you spend $100,000, it didn't work out, but you won because you learned enough that it was worth $100,000, whatever that calculation is, I think is kind of how you start to approach where could the demand be.
Yeah, and I think that orientation to learning versus having a concrete output that is ending up in the market and resulting in sales, like it's just a useful mindset shift when you're engaging in this work, that ultimately all of this is an effort to learn like what could be possible. Fantastic. We only have, we have another one. How much do you value the use of lead users in technology forecasting? I feel like that's a hard question because
Yeah. there's no one answer.
Depends, like Bradley could give the example of like quantified self folks. Like everyone thought that they were weirdos in the beginning, and now it's something that's very widespread. All the biohacking and of course tracking, like many of you I'm sure have fitness trackers on you that now do things like track your heart rate, your VO2 max, like very more like vital signs, like kind of for health. And so I think the value and the use of lead users, again, is like that permission space that Brad talked about. Sometimes the value of that is illuminating opportunity spaces that don't exist yet. And so then you have the opportunity to begin to craft them or cultivate them in a way that they become ready to be maybe more opportunities in a business sense and not just opportunities in a possibility sense. And so, yeah, it really depends. And of course, like it depends on your industry too. Like industries work on different timescales. Like I used to work a lot more in pharmaceuticals and biotech, for example, and the life cycle, the product development life cycle is much, much longer for getting a drug to a market or some kind of intervention to a market versus something that might be shorter, like a digital technology, like an app or a feature or something like that. And so you've got to work with the time scale of the space that you are in as well.
Yeah. Thank you for answering. I don't have to say that. I would echo that. The one other observation I have is, interestingly, and for whatever this is worth, I think B2B companies seem to care more about lead users than consumer oriented companies, at least in the, anecdotally in the experience I have doing this, and that who knows what that represents. But I think it's because, if I just sort of have a hypothesis on why that is that a consumer-oriented, consumer-facing innovation, they can sort of make a market, or at least they believe they can make a market. But if you're a B2B player, you're enabling the company that's trying to make the market. And so you kind of want to position yourself sort of as having some insight on the user and then having the solution. So for whatever that's worth, among the groups I've worked with, it's typically, though not always, the B2B manufacturers who really care the most about the lead users, which is very counterintuitive, but it has been kind of my experience. Can we answer that last question just for fun?
Yeah, the future work. I didn't know if you wanted to answer it.
Okay, so there's this question just to close. What will happen to the 40-hour work week? In 1930, Keynes predicted a 15-hour work week. The reason I just wanted to close on this, that it does actually kind of connect to something I was showing earlier, that slide with the different maps going in different directions. I think one thing that we've been on this probably a lot more than 20-year trajectory, probably 70, 80, 100-year longer, centuries long trajectory of technology being aimed at productivity and being aimed at like making us more productive. And then, and then the response has been politically and socially, well, now that we're more productive, let's imagine how we could be even more productive. And it's just been this kind of treadmill of like, now that I can like answer emails, like, from my bed at night, like, won't that be great? But I think one thing that we should be asking about kind of all kinds of futures and is not typically asked in technology is like, to what end and what are the values what are the values we're optimizing for? And the values we've been optimizing for are profits, so we can create more profits. And I'm not against profits. Those are valuable, those matter, and so on. But I think, societally, I think we are starting to see a shift to say, let's try the 4-day work week. Let's try these other things. And so I just wanted to end on this because I think one of the big lessons, hopefully, that you would take away from this conversation is don't think about technology just as a tool that can do one thing, but really think about what are the values and systems it's optimizing for. And I think more and more that's going to be a requirement in doing technology innovation.
Thank you. I think that's a perfect place to end. I just wanted to share a couple of slides as we're closing. Definitely add more in chat. There's other things that you wanted to address, but as I said before, sharing more about IFTF Vantage. This is our organizational partnership program where we do things like technology forecasting. If you want to look more at that, we have our research from our Future Ready organizations from 2020, where we explored science and technology capabilities and what that enables in organizations. You can learn more about IFTF Vantage in our next year's research, which will be about the decisive decade. on October 28th. We'll have a brief session where we'll talk more about our research agenda for next year, where we're really looking at changing concepts of value and also looking at the lens of place and what that offers in terms of the major decisions that are ahead of us over the next decade as we are in this, not post-pandemic, but certainly interregnum period of the pandemic, depending on who you're asking. And so join us on October 28th to learn more about IFTF Vantage and what that can offer your organization, and continuing to be in building your foresight capacity and being future ready. If you are looking for more learning opportunities and just upskilling foresight and really understanding more of the skills and the methods and techniques, we have a vast array of opportunities to do that you can see here on this slide. One in particular I wanted to call your attention to is that we have our Fast Future session on December 7th. This is an opportunity to learn just some of the really basic principles of foresight. This is a live 90-minute course taught by Jane McGonigal, our Director of Games Research and Development. So she's very amazing and engaging. And so it's a really great experience to really get introduced to foresight. That's coming up again on December 7th, 90 minutes for $99. Both a great experience and a great opportunity to connect with other new foresight practitioners. And with that, just wanted to close. Thank Brad so much for answering a lot of tough questions about what can be somewhat of a contentious topic. But I think hopefully you're leaving with some good ways of thinking about technology forecasting and bringing this into your work, to your teams. And if you're bringing it to your organization, certainly talk to us because we have a lot more to share if you are looking to really dig deeper into that as well.
Cool. Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thank you.